Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are joining us for this live online presentation and question and answer session on disaster displacement. We are gathered here live today on 13 October 2020, which is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And welcome to all the participants who have decided to watch this live. We also plan to put this recording online after the event, so that you can either tell your colleagues about it or also refresh your own memory. It's not a typical webinar in the sense that we're not presenting new evidence or graphs and presentations today about disaster displacement. It's more a conversation with colleagues and experts that are gathered around me here on the screen. And we're trying to dig into this topic of disaster displacement with a focus on a particular tool that we call the Words into Action on Disaster Displacement. My name is Sarah Kölzow. I'm the policy officer at the Platform on Disaster Displacement. We're based in Geneva. And we're hosting this webinar today with the help of my great colleagues Eric Muchayani and Afrin Shairash, who ensure that the technology works. And we're also going to monitor the question and answer box that all of you should see at the bottom of your screen. So if you're watching live on 13 October 2020 International DRR Day, then please ensure you write your questions in there. I will walk our colleagues and experts through a first round of questions based on all those of you who have already submitted as questions before the event. Thank you so much. I hope that those of you who have written to us recognize your questions and that we will be able to address as many as possible of those questions in the course of the next 1 hour. So without further ado, I want to turn to our first expert. And we have invited Bina Desai from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center to join us here today. As the name says, Bina, Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, you are the head of policy and research there. It's your job to monitor and also to estimate the numbers of displacements. And in your annual global report on internal displacement, you distinguish between displacements that happen in conflict contexts and those that happen in disaster contexts. So you're a very good person to ask, what is disaster displacement? Can you tell us what is meant by that term? And also, how big is that phenomenon? How many people are affected by it?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks to the PDD and UNDRR for inviting me to speak about disaster displacement here, which is really one huge chunk of the work that we do at IDMC is really monitoring displacement in such contexts. As you said, it's about displacement in the context of disasters, both sudden onset, so floods, earthquakes, cyclones predominantly, as well as slow onset disasters and environmental change processes such as droughts, sea level rise, etc. So disaster displacement, as we monitor it and as we define it, is an instance or a situation where a person is forced to flee their home or their habitual area of residence. In the context, as we say, of disasters, it's a function not just of the extreme event itself and a result of that itself, but really of the hazard of the flood, as well as a combination of then exposure and vulnerability. So are you exposed to that hazard? Are you in that instance there? But also, are you vulnerable to it? And that is very much determined by socioeconomic conditions, by demographic characteristics, etc. So what we are really trying to highlight repeatedly is that disaster displacement is not just as disasters, is not natural, it's not inevitable. It's not necessarily short-lived either, which is often a perception that it's just about evacuations, be it preemptive or spontaneous. It often ends up in protracted displacement of people who cannot return home, who are not part of the reconstruction process, and therefore then end up being IDPs, as we call them, internally displaced people.
Okay, thank you, Bina. That was an excellent definition, almost an introduction to the phenomenon. You described the different disasters and natural hazards that lead to the not so natural displacement of people in socioeconomic contexts that make the disaster a disaster and lead to the displacement. Is it right to assume, we have just heard in a UNDRR report published yesterday, that climate change leads also to more disasters in a way, but that those disasters look very different in each region. is it safe to assume that every region experiences disasters differently, and also that displacement in each region is different?
You could probably say that, and I haven't answered even the first part, the second part of your first question about the scale, and it's nicely connected to this question, because really the majority of all the new displacements, all those instances where people have to flee that we report on every year, are in the context of sudden onset disasters, and the vast majority of those are weather related. So also then subject to potential negative impacts of climate change. Just as an example, in 2019, we recorded almost 25 million instances of displacements in disaster contexts, and almost 24 million of those were in the context of weather-related hazards. So climate change, and particular for the Asia region, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, will definitely play a role in not just accelerating hazards, but also the underlying vulnerabilities that I mentioned by eroding people's livelihoods and their resilience overall.
Thanks so much, Bina, for also responding to the volume question. That's a huge number that you just told us. And interesting that you say it hits different regions differently. We're lucky to have two out of our experts here with us today from the region of Asia, Pacific, and Southeast Asia in particular. And you explained us so well what disaster displacement is. And I want to ask the next very good address that knows a lot about disaster risk reduction and about disaster displacement, because Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world work day and night and in every region to reduce disaster risk, to respond to disaster where it happens, and also to avoid displacement. And we're very lucky to have with us today Pauline Kaspeljan of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And Pauline, you are based in Southeast Asia in the Philippines, and you work for the Federation as a disaster law advisor. So I would like to ask you in how far this topic of disaster displacement really is a disaster risk reduction issue, and what DRR actors can do about it. To put it a bit provocative, if people are moving and are displaced and moving around in disaster context, isn't this something that ministries of migration or of the interior or of family or whatever are in charge of? Why is this something that needs to be addressed from disaster risk reduction experts as the audience here today for this online session?
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for the opportunity to share on behalf of IFRC. So that's obviously a big question, some of which have been answered by Bina earlier, given that, displacement in Asia Pacific and also specifically in Southeast Asia are caused by diverse hazards. So we have different hazards in the region. In displacement connected to sea level rise in the Pacific, coastal erosion and river bank erosion in Bangladesh, for example, typhoons and cyclones in Philippines and in India. It definitely is connected to DRR. And your question about how is it and why is it, how should it be addressed? Should it only be the Minister of the Interior and Migration, or should it also include other government agencies? Well, my answer to that is, sorry, I prepared for that. Okay. The answer is yes. It should be addressed by ministries of Interior and Migration, but they cannot address it alone because the causes and nature of disaster displacement, as I mentioned, are diverse. And in Asia Pacific, where we already know that this is one of the leading causes of displacement, what we call as NDMOs, or National Disaster Management Offices, have been very crucial in supporting the communities in understanding their risk profile, and at the same time using that risk profile to inform decisions on land zoning and subsequently planned relocation. So, for example, for those who live and work in Bangladesh, you are aware that riverbank erosion, or what we call as a silent disaster, has forced countless of persons to move away from their places of origin and relocate. The biggest insight that I got when I visited Bangladesh in 2019 to look at the displacement, a large-scale displacement there caused by a riverbank erosion in a place called what they call Shariatpur, is that while it was difficult for them to prevent this kind of large-scale erosion and the resulting loss of land, the community could have had enough lead time to think of Plan B had they understood and received early warning information on the riverbank erosion. And this information was already available. It was being handled not by the Ministry of Interior, but some other government agency. And had this been understood well by the community, then they would have had, it would have been possible for them to have a durable solution to their impending displacement. So the point really is, the sooner that we recognize that displacement is a diverse and homogeneous issue, the sooner both governments and humanitarian actors will adjust their way of working by using an inter-sectorial approach. And it has always, it always has to be done, not only at the national level, but always with the local communities, both those that are displaced and also the host communities.
Thanks so much, Pauline. That was a very comprehensive answer. And you mentioned an important number of tools and things that we can do and have to do addressing disaster displacement. You mentioned land rezoning, you mentioned planned relocation. You said that durable solutions are possible. And I like very much how you invite communities to have a plan B and to take the time and act on early warnings if we get them. And I think certainly well noted that you're saying it's not just DRR actors, but also DRR actors that have to connect with humanitarian, the migration people that I mentioned initially, and other actors. Can I stay with you in your region for just one more initial question and ask you to share maybe an example or recommendations from the Red Cross, so from the Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, maybe from your region in Southeast Asia. You shared some challenges and examples of how displacement looks in certain contexts. I think we all have that picture in mind now of riverbanks, collapsing and people moving. Can you put an image in our head what can be done to address disasters and ensure that displacement either doesn't even happen or is dealt with in the best possible way?
So I'll be very biased in my answer. With a disaster law background, my suggestion would be through law and legislation. No, but seriously, in 2019, the IFRC launched a global research looking at domestic laws on preparedness and response. And one of the key findings there is that effective laws on disaster risk management not only talk about the general 4 phases of disasters, but also specific cross-cutting issues such as human mobility or including displacement. And we have some recommendations based on our findings. Obviously, we found that it is not very well integrated. The issue of displacement is not very well integrated into disaster laws in most countries. There are good examples, but in most countries globally and including in Asia Pacific, these are not well integrated. So the general recommendation is that when we review our disaster laws and regulations, we should take the opportunity to include general principles, for example, on durable solutions to displacement. We can use disaster laws as a platform to establish the policy that planned relocation in the context of disaster should be a last resort approach. We can use disaster laws to clarify procedures for cases where displacement is an unavoidable consequence, and to make sure that the criteria for doing so are clear so that we know when it is lawful and when it is arbitrary. And finally, to make sure that in the laws themselves, whether in disaster laws or in standalone laws that deal with displacement, that the government and other actors have the responsibility to ensure that the human rights of those who are displaced and also of the host community will be protected. So those are very, very general recommendations, not just applicable to Southeast Asia, but to the rest of the region. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Pauline. Probably not just for the region, but very relevant to raise human rights considerations. And thanks for your bias as a lawyer, pointing to the law as a source of orientation and providing that framework. And that actually sets a very nice continuation or leads us to the tool that we want to present today, and our topic of how to really assure that disaster displacement is addressed at the national level through the law and also DRR strategies. And I want to turn to our next expert now, and we have the honor of having with us today Animesh Kumar. Animesh, you're the Deputy Chief and also Chief at Interim of UNDRR's Asia Pacific Regional Office. And since today, if you're watching this live, it's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And the motto of this year is, it's all about governance. So if Pauline had formulated the motto, she would have said it's all about the law. We say now it's all about governance. Can you explain our audience why we're talking about disaster displacement today at International Day DRR, that also focuses on a very specific target of the Sendai Framework, target E, is that correct?
Definitely. Thanks, Sarah. And good to see all the familiar faces on the panel and also among the audience. Let me offer some very quick insights into how from Asia Pacific, from a regional perspective, we see as how Target E offers some key areas of opportunity for integration of disaster-induced displacement. The first is in context of that the fact that most DRR strategies have mitigation strategies to reduce disaster impact. However, for displacement, which is one of the most common impacts of disasters, very few national governments in Asia Pacific have a multi-sectoral plan to prevent, prepare, or manage disaster displacement. The green light here is that most of the countries, at least 18 of 40 countries that come under our purview in a regional office, are in the process of developing or revising their existing targetee or aligned strategies, which means that they have a unique opportunity to ensure that this aspect of disaster impact can be very well integrated into their national strategies. The second opportunity we have is that there are several internationally agreed guiding principles which have placed systematically plans and policies on disaster displacement at the global level. For example, the Nansen Initiative or the ISC framework, even the words into action, but they need a vehicle at the national level to be incorporated. And again, the national DRR strategies provide a very valid basis to do so. The third opportunity I see is in context of coherence between disaster risk reduction and climate action. We are in the process of developing a regional report on this process to see what are the entry points, what are the safe spaces between disaster risk and climate change, and how countries are coming together for a coherent implementation. When we talk about coherence between DRR and climate action, we start with looking for common grounds for action, and displacement offers a very strong common basis. This can be done through a systematic integration of displacement risk in climate adaptation and disaster planning tools as part of a broader ambition to better integrate climate change adaptation as well as disaster risk management. The fourth opportunity I see is in context of humanitarian development nexus. We are piloting our checklist in Pakistan as they develop the humanitarian response plan. The exploring of common outcomes and durable solutions is the strongest basis for humanitarian development nexus. And a key means to do so, for instance, in a humanitarian response program, is to map each humanitarian action to a durable solution. And experiences have shown that this mapping is very direct in the case of displaced populations. And finally, in terms of addressing human mobility itself, where human mobility is a necessity to reduce exposure, for example, planned relocations or evacuations, national DRR strategies should inform migration-related laws. So you can see that there, the target E and the national strategies on disaster risk reduction offers different opportunities for integration of displacement risk at the national level. Over to you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you so much, Animesh, for adding very important additional actors also in this. We're hearing from you about the humanitarian development nexus. We're hearing also very good news, I would say. You mentioned, and maybe I can ask you something more in detail about that. You said that there's 40 countries in the Asia Pacific region that UNDRR is working with. And you said that you think 18 out of those 40 are already working on target E strategies. Can you just remind everyone who might not be so familiar what that target E is and how UNDRR is working with these governments to ensure these are developed? And just if you know of an example of a country that's already looking at displacement in these contexts?
Yeah, thanks. As you know that when the Sendai Framework was adopted, we also had 7 targets. And the fifth of this is target E. That's why we just call it target E. And it's almost become a nomenclature for national strategies. But the target E is essentially looking at national and local disaster risk reduction strategies. And not only in context of emergency response, which is just a very small component, but looking into how risk can be embedded into sustainable development processes. And we have released a very comprehensive guideline, the words into action for the countries to do so, which are being followed by several countries, including in our own region, to see that how they can make their existing DRR strategies as Sendai aligned as possible. While doing so, it's also important to note that the target E, which is the fifth target of Sendai Framework, is also aligned with SDGs 1, 11, and 13. So while meeting target E, countries are also meeting some of the SDG targets. Now, I would not go into details of the several examples from different countries, but perhaps a good example, I would say, from where a country has taken displacement from the pre-disaster phase, because most countries try to address it in a post-disaster stage. For example, Vanuatu's National Policy on Climate Change and Disaster-Induced Displacement is a very strong strategy that they already have, which complements their existing disaster management plan on integrating human mobility into development planning across the government processes and mechanisms. It also outlines the plans to manage and prepare for displacement and migration and support socio-cultural continuity in new locations. And a flagship that we always cite is Bangladesh, for example. We all know about the National Strategy on Management of Disaster and Climate-Induced Internal Displacement, which outlines an importance of shifting from a traditional response-focused approach to a more proactive, comprehensive approach, which embodies rights-based perspective. These are two of the shining examples from Asia Pacific that we are trying to cite and see how we can integrate some of these policy examples into the development and revision of the national DRR strategies so that we have one common policy on responding to disasters, but also preventing the risk that it generates. And one thing which I would like to point to, picking up from what Pauline was mentioning earlier, that we need to understand that there is no one-to-one relation between disaster risk reduction strategies and the national disaster management offices. It's the NDMOs in any country, or in any country, is only one of the actors that will be implementing the DRR strategies. The role of implementing the DRR strategies goes beyond the NDMOs and cuts across multiple sectoral ministries. They're responsible for implementing it. And unless it talks about the preventive aspects of risk, we will not be able to make it mainstream across sectors. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Animesh, again, for making the point of why this is important for DRR practitioners in NDMOs and also beyond. So this is an invitation again to ensure all of you watching this are speaking with your government and non-governmental colleagues about these issues as well. You have reminded us, Animesh, that this is very much a development issue. It's about also fulfilling the sustainable development goals. And you've given us just 2 examples. Thank you for being short and just providing one from the Pacific and one from Asia. I know there's more countries that are engaged and interested in these issues. And it's great to have examples and know where we can look for good practices or just see how other governments are dealing with this. And these are some of the questions that we have received also from participants of this online Q&A, asking how do different countries deal with this in the different regions. You have mentioned a number of important frameworks. You mentioned the Nansen Initiative, IAC tools, the words into action. I want to turn to Atle now. Atle is Atle Solberg, the head of the Platform on Disaster Displacement Secretariat. And Atle, you have a very solid overview of all these global frameworks that Animesh already mentioned. So I want to ask you a bit more in detail for the next couple of minutes. We talked about the Sendai Framework and Target E. It's about developing national DRR strategies. But outside of the Sendai Framework, what's the policy context at the global level? Which other relevant global policy frameworks, sustainable development and others are there that all of us here should be aware of and know that they need to be implemented to address disaster displacement? Over to you, Atle.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to everyone joining us in this panel. This is great. So before I talk a little about the global policies, I just wanted to go back a little what Bina said. Let's think about disaster displacement as a function of exposure vulnerability and the hazards themselves. So what can we do about these hazards? What can we do about the exposure, the fact that people are exposed to a hazard, and how can we strengthen their capacity to withstand that risk? And if you look at that way, the good news is that we have a lot to turn to at the global level. And particularly since 2015, we really have a set of tools, or almost a toolbox, that we can use to both prevent disaster displacement from happening, we can reduce the risk of it happening, and we can also manage displacement much better, at least if we implement these tools. I don't have much time, Sarah, as you haven't given me much. I'll just go through a few of them and try to also remind ourselves that there are different tools. So something very strong, of course, is an international treaty. We have the Paris Agreement under the Framework Convention on Climate Change that has been signed by states. That's a treaty. There's a lot of obligation in the Paris Agreement. And just to recall or remind everyone that the Paris Agreement has strong commitments to mitigate, meaning reducing greenhouse gases. So the global temperature shall stay well below 2 centigrades in relation to pre-industrial level. So that's the first thing we have to do. We really have to mitigate the adverse effect of climate change and reduce the emission. What is important for us, and that's why the Framework Convention on Climate Change is so important, is that there are strong adaptation commitments in the Paris Agreement to scale up the capacity to adapt to the adverse effect of climate change. And there are also strong commitment to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse effect of climate change. So there's also a strong work program under loss and damage. So we have a lot to turn to if you want to avert, minimize, and address displacement for what has been happening under the Paris Agreement and any decision made by the Conference of the Parties. Two other tools that are less formally binding. These are more compacts signed by states, but they also reflect strong political commitment. These are the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. And the importance of these two compacts, and particularly the Global Compact for Migration, is that the compact recognizes climate change, disaster, and environmental degradation as driver of human mobility. And also as driver of human mobility, we do not want to see such as displacement. There's a recognition that any migration or protection framework on mobility should recognize the drivers. And of course, these are mobility framework, the two compacts. So there are strong commitment also to manage and protect the rights of people displaced. So another two tools endorsed, adopted in 2018 are important to remember. And I cannot represent the platform on disaster displacement without mentioning the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, which also is a toolbox of all the measures state can use and others to manage the risk of displacement. But then also, how do we protect in situations where displacement is unavoidable, both when movement is within the borders of a country, but also cross-border. What are the protection measures that states can use based on their existing policies and legislations? I'm not going to say much about Sendai because Animesh told us the importance of the Sendai, but we also have to recall that in the humanitarian sector, you had the Agenda for Humanity of the Secretary General from May 2016. And that agenda also includes strong commitment to reduce displacement in half by 2030. So that's another expression of commitment to reduce the risk of displacement and keep the numbers low. I also want to remind everyone that the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda is central to everything we do. And I think Animesh said it very cleverly that the Sendai, if we implement the Sendai, we will also meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are several, for example, in goal number 10 and goal number 13, combating climate change, that are relevant for our works. And to finalize, I know clock is ticking, Sarah, human rights, of course, across the board, respect, promote, and fulfill human rights will keep risk down. If we are protecting, or all in human rights framework are protected, we will see much less displacement. And we need to also remind everyone that whatever the reason for people being forcibly moved, they shall be protected at all times, their human rights. So this was a flavor, Sarah. Paris Agreement, we have 2 global compacts. We have the Non-Sin Initiative Protection Agenda. There are commitments expressed in the World Humanitarian Summit and Agenda for Humanity. And then, of course, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Agenda, and human rights. So if you keep all those tools in mind, we will go a long way in doing better work.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Atle, for this run through the relevant global frameworks at the disposal of the entire community. And that also, if I may, show the commitment of states to address this issue of disaster displacement in each of the relevant sectors, and ideally also across them. So I think if I can recap a bit what we have heard from the experts up until now, it's that disaster displacement is a huge phenomenon. It affects many people that are displaced and also those hosting those displaced. Climate change is an important factor leading to more and more frequent and more intense disasters. So if we address climate change and if we implement all these different global frameworks that Atle just ran us through, and watch out for human rights, and then do what Pauline says and include that in the law and in the DRR strategies, this also means there should be tools and there should be ways for us to address disaster displacement and ensure that less people are affected and that those who are affected receive better protection. So with that little summary almost, or joint understanding, I want to now move the second half of our 1 hour to a presentation of a very particular tool that we would like to present here today. And the question is always, you have all these big global frameworks, but how do you really implement them? Many of you watching are in charge of your national government's DRR strategy or response to disaster risk reduction and prevention. And you have an interest, how should you implement the compact and the SDGs and the Sendai with all the different targets? And what UNDRR has launched a couple of years back after the Sendai Framework was agreed is a series of publications and guidelines. It's called the Words into Action. And that's a very good title. We have to put words into action. And there are several very good ones that you can consult on UNDRR's website. There is one, for example, on youth engagement and on building back better. And then there's also one that we particularly care about, which is the Words into Action on disaster displacement. And these guidelines were developed in a very consultative process. We were part as the platform on disaster displacement, and also many of our partners, all those of us around me in this call today, but also the International Organization for Migration, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, all provided very important input regarding addressing, preventing, and protecting people displaced in disasters. And maybe the most important actor leading on developing these guidelines and also now implementing them has been or is the Norwegian Refugee Council. And I'm very pleased that we can hear of 2 colleagues today from the Norwegian Refugee Council. And I want to turn to Sylvie Josa from NRC first. Sylvie, you're a consultant with NRC. You're the co-author of the Words into Action. And I know you could fill the entire hour presenting us the guidelines. But can you try to also give our audience a quick idea and an overview what that guidance is and how it can be used by DRR practitioners or perhaps also others in addressing disaster displacement? Over to you, Sylvie.
Thank you, Sarah. I promise not to spend an hour on this, but just a couple of moments to share with you the pretty face of the Words into Action on disaster displacement. And its full name is How to Reduce Risk, Address Impacts, and Strengthen Resilience regarding disaster displacement, of course. It is a companion for implementing the Sendai Framework Target E, which is what we've just been hearing about. So what it does, like all the other guides in the series, it provides practical guidance. And this one is to help governments integrate disaster displacement into their DRR strategies, and that's why it's a companion to the Target E, and as well as plans and policies. So because the target is DRR policymakers, then The guide provides some background on disaster displacement. For example, what are the specific needs of disaster displaced people as opposed to other people affected by disasters? And it introduces some of the concepts that we've heard about already in terms of human rights protection. It also shares some examples from around the world of countries that are addressing disaster displacement at national level as well as regionally. And the way that it provides this guidance is by going through the 4 priorities of the Sendai Framework. And so, for instance, one of the recommendations would be the collection of disaster displacement data, a subject near and dear to Bina's heart. How can we possibly address this if we don't know what we're dealing with? And so we need to collect information before, during, and after disasters, and then integrate that information into risk assessment. So in terms of governance, a subject very dear to Pauline's heart, because the main idea here would be to make sure that our laws have provisions that are specific about disaster displacement, and as well as our plans and our strategies, etc. And in terms of governance, having, for example, a focal point and a working group that cuts across government and that includes others beyond government, those are some of the recommendations. In terms of investing in disaster displacement, one of the recommendations would be to have a budget that is sufficient and planning for temporary as well as long-term displacement, because we might have this idea that it's going to be an evacuation and people will go home, but that's not always what happens, and it can become protracted displacement. And then a big part of the guide is about preparedness and recovery and building back better, and how to integrate disaster displacement, how to address it there so that people can build durable solutions, so they no longer have needs that are specific to their displacement. And so there are some mechanisms, for example, just to give you 2, quick replacement of lost documents, having a mechanism for that, having a mechanism to support people getting access to services, short, immediate during an emergency, but also longer term, such as integrating the job market in another area, accessing compensation, etc. So if I were to tell you about one message that is really key from this whole guide, it would be the meaningful engagement of people that are displaced, people that are at risk of displacement, and the host communities in the development of disaster risk reduction plans, so that their rights are protected and displacement is not long-lived if it cannot be avoided. And we have some additional tools. I don't know if I have time to tell you about them now, but I'll just mention them. There's a checklist that is geared toward disaster risk reduction practitioners. So it takes the same guidance that's in the main words into action, and has just very much a checklist for practitioners, and then an e-learning that we're developing and that my colleague Juan Carlos can tell you about in a bit. Thank you, Sarah. I hope I didn't go over.
Excellent, Sylvie. No, absolutely well done. Thanks so much. I think all we can do today on International DRR Day is to intrigue our audience to look at that guide for themselves. And I think you did an excellent teaser there, showing some concrete examples and describing how this can be a useful tool. And I think we're in a very good situation where we know we have guidelines and frameworks like Sendai and other tools. We have committed governments. And then we also have concrete tools like the ones that you described, including checklists and all the technical nitty-gritty stuff on how to put words into action on this important topic. So I know that we also have another colleague from NRC, Nina Birkeland, and unfortunately she's not able to be live with us at this very moment. So before the session, we have asked her to record with a short video her answer to a question, and we really want you to listen to Nina because Nina, just like Sylvie, are both working also on implementing the guidelines. So it's one thing to have the guidelines readily available. Sylvie was holding them up, so you can either grab them from Sylvie's hand or download them on the UNDRR website. They are available now in English, in French, in Spanish, in Arabic, in Nepali, and potentially in other languages. And if not yet, then you can also approach us and we can work with you to translate them. So the tools are all available, but we've asked Nina, since Nina of NRC is working with all of us partners, try and support governments to use and implement the tool. Nina, can you tell us how interested actors can get support to implement the words into action? And we've also asked Nina, it's special times. We're in 2020, COVID-19 is causing harm and impeding our activities. So what can we still do despite the pandemic now that the deadline of Target E is also coming close at the end of 2020? So I'll ask Eric to put as Nina on the screen and play us her short video. I hope it can work for everyone to see and hear Nina.
Hello, my name is Nina Birkeland. I work for the Norwegian Refugee Council on disaster displacement and climate change. And I was asked by the moderator to say a few words about how can interested DRR actors obtain assistance to implement these tools that Sylvie just presented. I think in a brief way I can explain that we as NRC, we are leading a project funded by Germany where we try to somehow contribute with the oil into the machinery of governments and national disaster management agencies. So with our work, we are there to try to help that when a government wants to do something on this, we can come in with expertise, with experience from other countries, and also since we've been working on these tools, we know very well how they work. So together with the platform of disaster displacement and UNDR, we've had some funding for the last year. We've been working with some specific countries, Nepal, Mozambique and South Africa, but also with some regional bodies, Caprale in the Andean region, Sepredenak in Central America, and IGAD in East Africa. And both on the national and regional level, we've been trying to kind of see how can disaster displacement be inserted in policy, guidelines and practice. One question that often comes up is how do we do this in each country? And I think it's important to remember that no country is alike. There's always different needs and different opportunities. So we really need to discuss it with each government, each national disaster management agency, how can it best be done in that country. But so far we have seen that very often working on guidelines is a good way to work on a country-specific level, because you don't necessarily want to revise a big policy you've made, but how can you then make specific guidelines that support that policy on disaster displacement? How do we do this? We really think that we can support from Geneva, but the main work needs and should be done in country, which means that in all the countries we have worked with national consultants, people from those countries who are already part of the discussion around DRR and could come in with disaster displacement expertise. So helping to maybe write, helping to facilitate discussions, and in that way make it possible to come up with guidelines or maybe policies that include this issue. We know that for several countries, this year is reporting on Target E. So of course, if disaster displacement can be included now, fantastic, but it's not the last chance. So even though we're passing Target E first deadline, there are many opportunities. I think also when we talk about how do we do it, what we really have seen is that in most countries, it's a willingness, eagerness to do it, but it might be an issue that wasn't prioritized in the beginning. So catching up on it and putting it in now. We have of course, now we're in a situation of the pandemic, so there are no face-to-face meetings. But we have been able to do a few things online. We heard about the e-learning from Sylvie, but also we do hope that as we kind of get past the peak of pandemic in different countries, we'll be able to do more face-to-face trainings, meetings, not only on a national level, but also on the local, regional level. So in South Africa, for example, this is planned, so as soon as it can be done, we will do it together with our partners there. I think also, as we move ahead, we have very good signals that there should be more money coming in, so we'll be able to continue this past 21. But anyone who's interested, please contact us, and then we can discuss how we do it. Thank you.
Excellent. So this was Nina Birkeland, the Senior Advisor on Disaster Displacement and Climate Change, speaking to you from a pre-recorded message and inviting all of you who are interested to really get in touch with all of us here. So this means if you're interested, either your UNDRR regional office or the Norwegian Refugee Council or the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and we can put in the chat field for everyone or make available under the video our website and email address so you know who you can contact to obtain more information and work together. Before we really start now picking up some of the questions that were put live now in the Q&A and also some of the questions that we have received beforehand, I just would like to take the opportunity to thank all of those who are really making these guidelines and our joint work on implementing those possible. And that's thanks to the financial contributions from the government of Germany, who have helped us develop and consult on the guide and also now implement it in different countries and regions, such as the ones mentioned by Nina. And we also have received great support from France and Norway and Switzerland and other states in trying to promote and disseminate the guidance, also to translate it in the different languages. So if you are interested to support us or get some support, then please contact the organizers and these partners here to work together on this and either try to meet the target E deadline still or work on disaster displacement and solid holistic DRR strategy beyond 2020 as well. We are now starting, and we have already, I hope, answered some of your questions that came in beforehand through the questions that I posed to the experts and colleagues on the panel. But we received an interesting question, not that there are more interesting ones than others, but the question posed by Martina from Switzerland is one that we also posed ourselves 2 years ago. So Martina asked whether there is an updated database for DRR strategies that include a reference to displacement. And if there is any one actor or platform of actors that keeps regular track of these types of development. And 2 years ago, we found the answer to be no. And so at the PDD, we conducted our own mapping and analyzed all the different national strategies and regional strategies that we could find. And the result, which is a huge database and a report, is available on our website. We're not in the position to update and track this live, but then of course we have done this together with UNDRR, and in all the regional offices there are focal points who know very well which countries are working on Target E. So I think among all of the partners here on this call, we do have that knowledge. And I've also learned from Bina, from IDMC, that there is a new tool that's the Internal Displacement Index, where there is also monitoring of policy development regarding DRR strategies, also on disaster displacement. So I think we have a solid database for this. And one of the results, or something that we found during that mapping, was that in the Americas, especially in Central America and the Andes region, there is quite solid disaster risk reduction strategies and laws in place. And since so many of you wondered about the regional level implementation and also countries, what does it look like in practice? We have asked our colleague Juan Carlos Mendez, who's the PDD regional advisor for the Americas and the Caribbean, to get up very early to be with us today on International Day for DRR and give us these answers and tell us how does it look like at the regional level, for example, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, to disseminate the words into action and implement it. Can you maybe give us an idea of what you've already done in the region?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. Greetings from Central America. Yeah, I would say interesting stuff is happening in the Latin America and the Caribbean region when it comes to the Words into Action Guide on disaster displacement. I would say we've been quite active in that area. For instance, we are having some interesting talks with the government of Chile. There is a chance for a national capacity building dissemination workshop on the Words into Action Guide, at least using the Spanish version of the Words into Action Guide, and that could happen in the near future. But also, Only 6 months after the Words into Action Guide was launched in Geneva, I believe was in May of last year, we went to South America, we went to Bolivia, and we conducted a first regional exercise, a first regional workshop, also a dissemination slash capacity building workshop, together with CAPRADE, as it was mentioned by Nina. CAPRADE is the Andean Committee for the Prevention of Disasters, which is comprised of 4 countries, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And it was a very good exercise where we sat down for 2 days actually to discuss best practices, challenges, gaps, and opportunities to integrate disaster displacement into national and subnational strategies. Not only disaster risk reduction strategies, but also from a development perspective, as it was mentioned by our colleague Pauline from IFRC and our colleague from UNDRR, Animesh Kumar. It was a very good example of how we can actually take the Words into Action Guide out there and disseminate its content. But also, as it was also mentioned by Nina, we are going to have a first regional workshop on the Words into Action Guide in Central America. We are developing an e-learning tool where we discuss different aspects of the Words into Action Guide, but also we bring to the discussion different scenarios, made up characters, made up scenarios, where the users will be able to discuss the different stages, the different stages of the displacement cycle, as it is explained in the Words into Action Guide. That virtual first phase will take place by the end of this year. The e-learning will be released by the end of November, so that's happening this year. The first stage, and the second stage will be a face-to-face workshop that is going to take place somewhere in Central America, a country to be confirmed, because we're still pending on the development of the pandemic, but that's taking place around February, March, I believe, in Central America. We do have some ideas also on how to take the Words into Action Guide, not the Spanish one, but the English version to the Caribbean, but we can discuss this later. We have some lessons learned from those first experiences in South America, but I don't think I have much time, Zara, but I can take a few questions from the audience. I believe there's a question on challenges integrating disaster displacement considerations into national policy. But let me just say, Zara, a few words on plans for next year, because we're going to Jamaica to the regional disaster risk reduction platform that is organized by UNDRR. And actually, for the second time ever, we are organizing a technical session on disaster displacement. Actually, it is titled How to Integrate Disaster Displacement Considerations into National Policy Strategies and Plans. And that particular session has been organized by PDD, UNDRR, IOM, and IFRC. So if you happen to be in Jamaica next year, by July of next year, you're more than welcome to join us. I'll stop here, Sarah, because I already talked for more than 4 minutes.
No, thank you, Juan Carlos. That's excellent. Thanks for inviting us all to Jamaica. And let's really hope that we can then travel again and are past these hard COVID-19 days. Thank you also for this excellent teaser on the e-learning. I think we're all ready now to download the guidance and look at the checklist and waiting for the e-learning tool to be released. I've had a sneak preview and can already tell you that it's great work that you're doing for the region and perhaps also to be applied in other regions. And indeed, Juan Carlos, I just mentioned to you that we got a question from the audience of this webinar on challenges. And I think it's also important not just to say what's there and what's working and what could be implemented, but Nazmul from Bangladesh and also Alexandra from Switzerland are asking, how is your assessment of the Words into Action guidelines? And in your experience, what are the main challenges to the implementation of displacement considerations into DRR strategy? And I thought I'd ask you, since you work with the governments in Latin America and can give us maybe an idea of this.
Yeah, that's a very important question. It's a very want to answer. But what we learned from the workshop in Bolivia is that there is a need to understand disaster displacement as a complex phenomenon that goes beyond the response, that goes beyond the first humanitarian response. It is a development issue, and that was one of the key lessons learned from that workshop. Those 4 countries really wanted to see disaster displacement at the center of development, actually. To understand the whole cycle of displacement means collaboration, coordination between different sectors, a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach, if you will, including other non-stakeholders, but also understanding that disaster displacement has to do with development, as I said, but also has to do with finding durable solutions and resilience, as Sylvie said, building back better, right? So that's one of the challenges that we saw in the Caprade workshop, and I'm sure we are going to see the same challenges in Central America by the end of this year when we have the workshop.
Great, thank you. The next question that I would like to put perhaps to Pauline, if you would like to take this one, Pauline. We got a question from Elise in the UK, a very short one. That's good, that's easy for me to read and post. She says, those who are living in a situation of displacement are most at risk of being displaced again. So she's talking about repeated displacement. Is there any way, from what we have discussed, from your experience also, what we can do to change this?
Well, it's definitely a difficult situation faced by a lot of IDPs. And I guess there's no easy answer to that, but from what I know and from what I've seen in when I went to Bangladesh to look at that, it was it was a simple riverbank erosion problem that they faced all the time, but the threshold issue of knowing which households were displaced is a first step. Because normally people move around and are not, because they're not able to find a long-term solution, right? So they move around because they don't know what plan B will be. And in that situation, we saw that had there been a proper understanding of their preferences, for example, they were willing to stay in that same area, even through rental assistance. But that wasn't, they weren't really being consulted, or there was a failure to consult, maybe because it was beyond the capacity of the local government, or it wasn't really a priority within the response phase. But as mentioned by Juan Carlos, it is actually more of a developmental concern, right? More than humanitarian response. So I think understanding first who are the displaced and what is keeping them from making that decision that is sustainable for them is one step. So just a simple definition of displacement in the law itself is very powerful, because when you have a definition, then that will support your advocacy for rights that refer to the displaced, rights to compensation, right to be consulted. But you have to define them first and identify them as a specific group with specific needs and magnified vulnerability.
Okay, thank you for giving your perspective on this. And we also can read in the Q&A that Kate from the US is finding it very important also to coordinate with local communities and involve and really find out about the needs and to develop Plan B, as you're saying, Pauline. I would like to ask a question to Animesh now, and please try to be brief. We are really short on time here, but there's a question here from Alicia from Germany and Lugard from the US, how climate change adaptation is being integrated in DRR planning and more broadly in DRM, so disaster risk management in the context of displacement. You were speaking a little to this before. Can you add anything on how to address and include climate change more broadly?
I think to answer it very in a time-bound way is essentially the difference between climate and disaster risk management is gradually dissipating more at the conceptual level and increasingly at the policy level. The challenge we see is more at the institutional level. But I would also see that there are some green lights which I can right away point to. For example, many of the Green Climate Fund adaptation funding components are essentially DRR funding. Many of the solutions from the disaster risk reduction side are at the short and medium term level answers to the long-term climate problems. Heat wave is a very good example. Nature-based solution is coming up as a very practical means to bring disaster risk and climate community together. We have just today launched a Words into Action for consultation partnership with a partnership for ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, PEDAR. Insurance is providing very good avenues for index-based insurance, for example, to bring DRR and climate community together. So I would say that there are some great developments happening towards coherence. We are actually adding an annex to the Words into Action on national strategies, on coherent DRR strategies to bring climate and DRR components together. And as I mentioned earlier, we are initiating a very comprehensive study in Asia Pacific that will see what are the entry points at the national level that will bring together climate and disaster implementation in a more coherent way. So that's a study we are initiating with the Stockholm Environment Institute. And we have, as discussed with Sarah earlier, we will ensure that displacement remains a common basis for bringing the two together. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much also for being brief. I can see there is huge interest in so many topics, and we probably don't have the time to address them all today. So let's find opportunities to continue this question and answer exchange. I see super interesting questions here coming from South Sudan on financing, coming from Mozambique on planned relocation. Maybe I can just say that at the Platform on Disaster Displacement, we're now engaging in research on planned relocation. So maybe at some point we can have a specific conversation more focused on the challenges and experiences with these. Maybe I just want to pose one more question quickly and give Atle the opportunity also to jump in as maybe the last concluding speaker here, because we have a question from Dr. Brigg from India and also Salvador from Mozambique. And they distinguish between internal and external disaster placement and want to know which global tools there are to protect the rights of communities evacuated in disasters to foreign countries, and whether the strategies to address internal and external disaster displacement are the same or different. That also is a question for 1 hour. I'm sure you can give us 2 minutes. Please have a go, Atle.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that these are two great questions, and let me try to go for the first one, and then you just cut me off if I'm too extensive. The problem is, and this is something the Nansen initiative identified, that the rules and the protocols when people are displaced to another country are not very clear at international level. There is what we could call a normative or a policy gap, because it's not really clear what are obligation on states to admit people onto their territory, and what rights are people afforded if they happen to be displaced across an international border. So that's a complicated territory, and it is defined very often as a policy and a normative gap. What we did find in the Nansen initiative work, and this is very important to remember, that although there is absence at the international level or limited guidance, there are, of course, tools that state can use. So what we have seen is that many countries are using their regular migration policies and legislation to admit people. We have seen that all over the world, that regular migration legislation, for example, through a humanitarian visa category or a temporary stay category, can be used to admit people displaced across border. We also know that if countries have free movement of person arrangement between themselves, people can cross borders without further complications. So that's also an important tool to govern in this situation. We do know that refugee law has been used. For example, after the earthquake on Haiti in 2010, refugee law has been applied by some countries, particularly if you are in a complicated situation where violence, breakdown of public order and the disaster are kind of combined, and people may be refugees in these circumstances. And finally, what is maybe an opportunity for the future is human rights law. There is a decision by the Human Rights Committee indicating that if people's lives are at risk, There might be standards that states need to follow in terms of not returning people back to a disaster situation. This is an evolving area, but again, human rights can be applied. And then I think the distinction between internal and external is very simple in the way that as long as we manage risk and try to avoid displacement, that distinction doesn't really matter whether people are internal or external. It only matters the moment people cross the border. And the big difference is that when you cross the border, you are no longer citizens of that country. And that means you are into a different legal category. And that are where some of these challenges arise, which I've explained in terms of the gaps. So over to you, Sarah. I tried to do that very quickly. It's an excellent question. And particularly on the first one, I think what our message is that you have tools to admit people. You have the tools to issue humanitarian visa and temporary stay. So states should really use those when your neighboring countries and the citizens of your neighboring countries are in trouble because of a disaster. Thank you, Sarah.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Atle, again, for the effort on trying to be short on such a complex issue. I think for today's purpose on the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, all of you here around me have done an excellent job and shown what your areas of expertise are and how we are all working together to tackle this issue. And I would invite all of you, whether you're watching this live today or later on, to address your questions to us. If you're online, you can see in the chat, thanks to Afrin and Eric for including here the links to all the partners, the checklist that was mentioned, the different tools from IFRC, from NRC, from UNDRR. Please follow us, find out more about these tools online and contact us. Let's stay in touch. I can see there's many people warming up, posing questions. Apologies, Charles from Kenya, me here from India. We're going to try and remain in touch with you outside of this online event today. It's really time to close now. We have learned there is an issue here and there are many tools how to address it. So let's take stock again how we're faring in a few months time. And until then, I wish you a very happy International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction today on 13 October 2020. And thank you all so much for your presence today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and let's be in touch. Thank you all. Goodbye.